Hello and welcome to the program. Kazakhstan's president has told police to shoot without warning as the crackdown on anti-government protests intensifies. Kassym-Jomart Tokarev accused 20,000 people, whom he labelled bandits, of rampaging through the largest city of Almaty. More troops from a Russian-backed security alliance have arrived to support the government. Demonstrations started several days ago, sparked by the rising cost of natural gas, but quickly turned into anti-government protests. Dozens have been killed, hundreds injured and thousands arrested. NATO Secretary-General says the military alliance and its allies are closely watching unfolding events in the country.
We are concerned, we regret the loss of lives, and of course it is important that violence ends and that human rights are respected, including the right of peaceful demonstration and freedom of expression. And many allies have expressed this, and I expressed this as Secretary General of NATO.
Earlier, I spoke to Adam Hug, the director at the Foreign Policy Centre in London. He says the protests in Kazakhstan are unprecedented in scale and scope.
You've seen over the last decade or so a number of major economic protests. In 2011, which is probably the closest comparator around the Zhernozem massacre. But since then, you've had a number of economic protests around quality of living, the cost of living issues, as more and more citizens have been unable to benefit from Kazakhstan's wealth, under a continuing kleptocratic elite that runs the country. But you've also seen smaller political protests that have been squashed very, very hard by the government. Previously, the economic protests has been, in recent years, particularly the mothers' protests and other protests in 2019, ended up with the government resigning and in that case, former President Nazarbayev standing down. The government tried that playbook this time, but it continued to increase. And you've had, obviously massive public and predominantly peaceful protests going on around the country. And then you've seen over the last few years, more violent looting and rioting, the cause of which is unknown, and it is very difficult to speculate because the internet has been down, communications in and out of the country have been very, very difficult. So trying to identify what lay behind that, by the sounds of things, potentially quite organised looting and rioting that took place, and has taken the security situation away from the government and away from the peaceful protesters. That remains to be seen. But you've got a situation where the president is calling for the security forces to shoot people without warning. You've had a massive change inside the elite where former President Nazarbayev and his clan have been booted out effectively by all accounts. So there's real change going on both at a top level in Kazakhstan and on the ground.
Tensions are rising between Europe and Russia, not just over Kazakhstan, but also Ukraine. NATO foreign ministers have been meeting in Brussels and warned that there is a genuine risk of a new armed conflict in Europe. Chris Pitchers reports.
NATO must be prepared for the failure of dialogue between Russia and the West. A bleak thought, but a possibility according to the military alliance's Secretary-General. The organisation's foreign affairs ministers met on Friday via video link to try and figure out how to tackle Moscow's military build-up in and around Ukraine. The Western alliance is concerned by the risk of a military conflict should diplomatic efforts to de-escalate the crisis fail. NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg added that Moscow's demands are unacceptable.
The whole idea that Ukraine is a threat to Russia is to put the whole thing upside down. Ukraine is not a threat to Russia. I think, if anything, it is the idea of a democratic, stable Ukraine which is a challenge for them. And therefore NATO will continue to provide support to a partner, to a sovereign nation, but also, of course, recognizing that Ukraine is a partner, not a NATO ally.
Moscow claims Ukraine as part of its sphere of influence and wants reassurances that it won't be allowed to join the Western military alliance. That demand has been flat out rejected by the US and NATO, which point to the right of all nations to choose their own alliances. EU leaders, however, have been more reserved on Ukraine's prospect of NATO membership. Next week, the Ukraine crisis will be the subject of intense diplomatic activities, with top representatives of the US and Russia meeting in Geneva. Chris Pitchers, Euronews, Brussels. Brussels.
French health officials estimate the peak of the current wave of coronavirus infections will hit in 10 days. On Wednesday, the country recorded more than 332,000 cases, the highest number seen since the start of the pandemic. There have been 204 new deaths recorded, taking the total COVID death toll to more than 125,000. President Emmanuel Macron has stood by recent strong remarks he made against those who remain unvaccinated, saying it was his responsibility to sound the alarm. Germany has announced a raft of new restrictions to curb the spread of COVID-19. Access to bars and restaurants will be limited to people with either proof of a booster shot or proof of a vaccination with a negative test, or proof of a recent COVID recovery, but also with a negative test. Only 14 of Germany's 16 states say they'll implement the new measures. Our reporter in Germany, Kate Brady, says the head of state of Bavaria has questioned the efficacy of these new restrictions.
It's not all that simple at first glance, but the bottom line is that it's still very much the same rule as before for people who are either unvaccinated or cannot prove that they're recently recovered. They are not getting into any restaurants, bars or cafes or anywhere like this rather cosy looking Italian here behind me. So who can get in? As you just briefly wrapped up, people who can prove that they've got their booster shot, they're allowed to go in to cafes, bars and restaurants, and you'll also still be able to go in if you can prove that you are fully vaccinated or recently recovered, but also with a negative rapid test from the day that you're trying to get into one of those places. We know at least 14 of Germany's 16 states are going to be implementing these rules, but one of the states, Saxony-Anhalt in eastern Germany, they've already said that they're not going to be pushing through these rules just yet because most of the new recorded cases in that state right now are still the Delta variant and not Omicron. And also down in Bavaria, the state premier there says that he's very much still on the fence at the moment about this new rule, saying that he's skeptical because there are still so many unanswered questions, he says, especially when it comes to the Omicron variant. But on top of that, we've also seen some new changes to the quarantine rules here in Germany as well. The quarantine time for people infected or contact people has been reduced from 14 days to 10 days. But you can test out if you're symptom-free and can show a negative PCR test after 7 days, and that's going to be even lower for people who are key workers working in the healthcare sector, for example. That will be 5 days. But there are also exemptions now from quarantine if you have a booster shot or if you are what the government's describing as freshly fully vaccinated or freshly recovered, and by freshly they mean within the last 3 months. So some quite complicated changes, but again, as you said, this is very much to try and stop the curve of the Omicron variant right now, which accounts for some 44% of the new cases of COVID-19 here in Germany, and that number's creeping up by the day at the moment.
And briefly, before taking office, Olaf Scholz said that he was in favour of making vaccines mandatory by the beginning of February. Has there been any movement on this?
Well, we know for certain that as of the middle of March, healthcare workers will be required to prove that they're fully vaccinated. So just over 2 months now for them to make sure that they are fully vaccinated. But on top of that, Olaf Scholz said today that there is still very much talk of a vaccine mandate for the entire country, and that's going to be discussed soon by the Bundestag, the German parliament. But he said today that he feels that he has at least the maximum support from the 16 state premiers here in Germany, who have all said that they would be in favour of compulsory COVID-19 vaccinations.
The aviation industry is being scrutinised for flying empty planes in order to retain takeoff and landing rights at European airports. Currently, airlines must operate flights in at least 50% of their slots or risk losing them. This threshold was brought down from the usual 80% when the pandemic hit in 2020. Environmentalists are calling on the European Commission to scrap the rule due to the unnecessary impact on the climate. Earlier, I spoke to Alex McCheras, an aviation analyst in London. He says many Europeans are cautious about travelling, and this is being reflected in booking data.
The airlines are realistic in this specific circumstance. Omicron has caused ultimately a dent in air travel recovery. Air travel demand is very low right now. It's a combination of the fact that January is a quiet month anyway, combined with the fact that Omicron is peaking across Europe at this time, and people are in isolation. There is uncertainty about whether or not they can travel, whether they want to travel, and people are ultimately holding off. And with air travel demand being so weak, it is simply without justification that the European Commission can keep the cap at 50%, requiring airlines, if they want to hold on to their all-important slots, to continue to fly 50% of that schedule, something that has led to this phenomenon as what is being called ghost flights, where airlines are being forced by this rule to fly thousands of empty or nearly empty flights. The other flights, that the other 50% threshold that the European Commission don't have control of and airlines have flexibility, well, there's many cancellations in there. Lufthansa, Finnair, Brussels Airlines, just some of the airlines that have cancelled hundreds and hundreds of flights from that schedule. But this unrealistic policy is not in line with where air travel is today.
Can such policies be adjusted during the COVID lapse, at least?
Well, what the airlines are calling for is not the kind of abolishment of this policy, but of the European Commission to actually look at the data of air travel demand, which is available to all of you right now from organizations such as IATA, and to recognize that we need to do more to help the industry, given that we are all in this together, rather than try to say, okay, airline A, if you're unwilling to fly this route, we're going to give away your slots to another airline that might. Hint, European Commission, there is no other airline that is willing to take on that slot when there are no passengers. And that's the situation that the airlines find themselves in now. We hope that there will be steps taken in the right direction, not least because of the climate crisis, but it's probably unlikely because from March, we are expecting things to pick up a little more, and the bookings are reflecting that. So at the moment, time will tell.